Great, let's get started. Hi, everybody. I'm here to talk to you about Htmx. And I created a I tried to be a little bit provocative with the title. A lot of the kind of ideas behind Htmx and how it works, and as you'll see soon, really just kind of banks off of what the web was, the way that the web was built initially. And it I might talk a little bit about this, but a lot of the topics around this have to do with kind of misinterpretations of the REST paper in some ways. Very hot topic. A lot of people have discussions about this, and I find it really interesting. It might actually solve some of the issues we've had. And anyway, I'll tell a little bit more about that. But let's just get started. So this talk, I know this is a JavaScript meetup. This is less about JavaScript and more about less JavaScript. So it isn't about no JavaScript. It isn't about like forget all your JavaScript, forget all the stuff you do on the front end. Oh, you're right, Ryan. I just heard that. It is really about making your applications more efficient and still keeping really good UX. What we have seen is sort of an abuse of what the browsers can do in a lot of ways. And we see the web apps delivering sometimes megabytes of JavaScript, and it is just not great. It slows down, ruins your Lighthouse scores, affects your SEO, your UX. There's a lot of problems with it. Developer experience sometimes isn't that good. Your build steps are slow. There's a lot of issues with it. Doesn't mean you should drop everything you're doing and just completely change it, but it's just another tool in your tool belt. So a little history. The good old days of the web, 1.0. You would open up Notepad, HTML, you would crank that out, upload it to GeoCities, and you had a website. And it was great. Spinning 3D GIFs, video game tips. That's what I did. You would just have fun. And, if you ever go to like the GeoCities archive, super wholesome content. It's insane. It's not the internet as we know it now. It's completely different. And it's actually really fun. And then Web 2.0 comes along. Ajax becomes a thing, jQuery becomes popular. And I put here ASP.NET Web Forms update panels for anybody that was around in the days of .NET Framework and update panels. HTMX is basically update panels without some of the insanity behind them. So I know some people here, like Levente, we've talked about this too, like the view state and all the crazy things we have to do to make it work. I think HTMX kind of brings you a lot of that UX and that client-side update that's really nice for user experiences without all of the nonsense behind it. Keeping to the theme of being stateless in your web apps, which is really important. Then, of course, we have Knockout and Angular, React, Vue, Solid, blah, 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 and it keeps going on forever. This is where we're at now, right? We have these really bloated web apps, really rough Lighthouse scores sometimes, not all the time. And then kind of what's coming is sort of like these WebAssembly front ends, and it's sort of becoming a thing. In .NET, we have Blazor. So you write C#, that gets compiled into WebAssembly, runs in your browser, and in theory, you don't have to write any JavaScript. And wouldn't that be nice? But it ends up not being true. There's limitations to it, of course. It might get better, and I think it's a very bright future. But what's interesting is kind of that's how far we went and how far we got. And then somebody said, you know what if we just take a step back and let's think about what we're doing and maybe reconsider it and say, maybe we're doing too much. Maybe we could simplify things. And what's really brilliant is sort of they looked at what the web and what your browser is really doing for you. One of the things, as you'll hear about this, HTMX is all about rendering HTML. Being able to serve HTML from your server is one of those things that almost weirds people out because you're used to getting JSON from your server. And as you'll see when I do the demos, all you're getting from your server is HTML. And it puts people off a little bit. And it put me off at first too. Then there's this concept of HateOS. Hypermedia as the engine of application state, which is a really complicated term for basically saying, and I'm going to butcher this a little bit, but essentially HTML is a language that represents hypermedia, so a combination of text, video, different types of media to make it to have rich experiences. It also represents application state. So for example, if you were visiting your bank's website And at a very simple level, let's say they give you a link to your check account balance page and a form that allows you to do a transfer with certain fields. Everything is very clear and very discoverable. Comparing to something like JSON, where you might just get, in some cases, not always, right? You might get, oh, here's the URL to go to the account page, or maybe you just have to know it because you use Swagger or something like that. HTML really just shows it to you right there, and it's very clear, and it's clear to the client, your browser, and to the user as well, right? And so all of this sort of becomes or brings about the sort of decoupling of the client from the server. And a lot of these concepts, I won't go into it too deep because I'll be honest, I'm not the most qualified to explain them, but a lot of this has to do with um, again, sort of a misinterpretation, and I don't want to say I don't want to say we've gone necessarily the wrong way, but it's definitely strayed away from what REST was originally supposed to be. Being able to decouple your client from your server means that as your server grows and scales and expands and whatever you're doing with it, your client doesn't have to change. The client stays the same. The server does everything. It sends all the behavior down. It sends all the discoverability down, and everything just kind of keeps working. And it's really cool. So imagine if you can maintain your rich UX, right? And so what this means, you can see frameworks like Next. The first thing they do is I'm going to put all of your navigation client side. Now, disclaimer, I don't love client-side navigation. I think it's a little bit weird sometimes. If you don't have like spinners and things like that, it can get it just feels weird, at least to me. And like generally full page reloads can suck if you're doing something very small, right? So if you have a small app and you just want to submit it and see a result, you don't need to refresh the full page. It's not even that efficient for your server, and for your users, it's not going to be a good experience. We also have, again, I mentioned the builds, right? So I'm sure most people here have dealt with a Webpack build. Now they're getting better. If you use Vite, it's a lot smoother and faster. But I've seen Webpack builds that can take minutes. Local development can take, sometimes, you might take multiple seconds to see your output. If you look at like what's happening with Next and the app directory, it's super slow. They're working on it. I'm sure they have a lot of great talent there, so I'm sure they're going to figure it out. But DX is not necessarily the best. We also rely on JavaScript dependencies like crazy. Wouldn't it be nice if we could do less of that? So what was it that I was installing the other day? I think I was trying, I think it was Solid, or maybe not Solid, and don't quote me on this. I remember installing some popular framework. It might have just been Next or something. Anyway, whatever it was, it installs, classic NPM. Here's your 30,000 dependencies, and you have 150 high or critical vulnerabilities, and you got to resolve it. And I'm like, okay, and I just move on and I do whatever I got to do because I don't have the time for that. And because it's just too much work. So imagine if we could at least reduce that burden, right, to a point where it's actually manageable. One of my favorite things about this, your backend doesn't matter. You can bring whatever you want. Isomorphism is something that you don't really hear that term as much anymore. But when Node.js became a thing, and then you realize like, oh, it's the same language on the back end and on the front end, and now you have these frameworks like Next, and you do server-side rendering and client-side rendering, and it's all like really beautifully integrated, and you got React server components, and all that stuff is great. What happens if your backend isn't Node for whatever reason? For us, a lot of the work we do is .NET, so we don't get this capability a lot of the time, and we've had to figure out a lot of workarounds. And I've given talks about some of the workarounds I've given on this, because it really is one of the biggest issues that we are dealing with. And we like JavaScript, we like these rich UIs, but we need to be able to do it in a way that really makes sense. And what if you could increment this or adopt this incrementally? What if you didn't have to just do a full rewrite? What if you could just replace certain pieces of your app that have issues, right? And that sounds pretty cool. So here comes Htmx, and yes, it is going to add a little bit more JavaScript. You can just put, the script include in your HTML like you would have done with jQuery out of a CDN or something. It's 14 kilobytes, which gzipped, which relative to other things, it's like half of React DOM, I think. Double Preact, so I'll say that much. But it's very small. Supports things. It'll give you support for things like Ajax and CSS transitions, even WebSockets and SSE, server sent events. I had no idea that was a thing, so I learned about that, so that was cool. And everything that you do, all of the interactions in your app will be done through element attributes. So in this example, I just put a button here. That hx get, that is a type of attribute that you put on there, and it tells it when this button triggers, in this case, it'll be a click by default, make an hx request to that URL, and then replace, the output in the browser with whatever the server sends back, which will be more HTML. And what's interesting too is generally you're used to having whether it's buttons or anchors or forms that actually by default will allow your browser to execute requests. HTMX makes it so that you can put it on a div if you want, and it'll work just fine. And you may have thoughts on that. I'll show you some examples, and you can let me know what you think. But it really expands on what the browser is kind of natively capable of, and it gives you a lot of really cool opportunities. So when I was thinking about this and I was practicing the talk, and it sort of, I realized like the complexity right now that we have is that we have to deal with server-side versus client-side rendering. If you look at how you would build a React component, if you're using Next, you have to think about like, okay, what happens when it renders on the server? What about the client? React Server components, I know, kind of help bridge that gap. But what if you didn't have to worry about the other one? What if you could just render on the server and leave it at that, right? Now, why would you do that? Again, hydration, resumability, these are complicated concepts. They have their place. This doesn't mean that you shouldn't be doing any of this stuff. It just means that it is complexity that you put in your developers, right? So I can't tell you how often I've had to teach server side versus client side and why you would use either one of them. How do you optimize, right? Performance and CDN, how do you deal with that? And how do you teach, especially junior developers? Most of those acronyms at the bottom there are real. As part of as, as part of what Lighthouse actually cares about. And I know way too much about them now, and it is exhausting, right? And so much of this can get a lot easier if you don't have all this JavaScript that slows down your pages, right? Simplicity is a big part of this, right? And I'll show you the demo. And I think simplicity and development, I think, is definitely relative. So for me, it's simpler. I have a backend that gives me HTML, and the app works. I haven't written a single line of JavaScript. You can enhance it with JavaScript if you want, and there's different libraries, and we'll talk about that at the end. But there's a lot of benefits there. And of course, SEO. For most of what SEO requires, you need to server-side render. If you're not server-side rendering and you care about SEO, you're doing it wrong. Like, to me, that's just kind of where that ends. You also need good performance now. We've had issues with sites that are slow, and I talk about it during my solid talk. The sites are slow. Google looks at that. Google says that's bad, and then they don't index you, or they reduce the odds of you getting indexed, and that's a big problem, right? So if you can make your site execute faster, even better. So let's look at some code. So, and actually, I realized now I probably should have changed the slide because I want to not necessarily be in VS Code as much during this. And the reason is that everything that I'm really going to show you, all of the code that you really need to see is going to be right here. It's going to be what the browser sends back. And I'm going to make this, if I can make this a little bit taller for you guys. No? Well, that's a shame. Let's see. I know, where was the, nope. Okay, hold on. Other throttling. Well, just a little weird because it's. Can you all see it on the bottom right here? I'll do this. Can you all kind of see it over here? You might struggle. You might be able to see it over there. Fortunately, we have the two screens. But as I was kind of preparing for this, I realized that I didn't have to go back to VS Code to show you what the code was on the server. Now, I will show you a couple things in a little bit, but know that this server is an ASP.NET Core server using MVC. Very old, like I don't want to say it's old school, we use it for plenty of other things, but it is not necessarily what we're used to seeing, especially in the JavaScript ecosystem. And so what I did, selfishly, I came up with a little e-commerce sort of sample with some of the concepts and issues that we generally run into, and I wanted to figure out how I could solve them with Htmx, and because we might use it, so I want to figure this out, and hey, we get a talk out of it, right? So that's great. And so I started with I wanted to create a little product listing and then do some other stuff, and I'll show you that in a second. But first, let's look at a little sample. So I'm going to make this a little bigger, and hopefully this will be pretty clear here. There we go. So I'm inspecting this button, and what you'll see is I have an hx get that makes a request to the server on this slash date endpoint. So it's going to make a get request as soon as it happens. If you don't provide a special kind of trigger, when I click it, it will trigger. And then I have to specify a target, which is this. You see, it's a CSS selector, so hash date, and it'll hit the endpoint or the element right here, and it should put whatever the server sends in there. So let's just try it. And it works, right? I didn't write any JavaScript for this. The only thing is I just put the Htmx tag in there, right? And if I show you in the network tab, and I click it again, here's date, and this is what the server's sending back. It's just some HTML, and we just embed it in the right location. Now, we can actually do a little bit more. And for this, I will show you a little bit of code. Oh, just a little bit more, Joe. There isn't, here, I'm going to show you. And I know I said I wasn't going to show too much code, but where is the date? There we go. No, not this one. Sample. Yeah. Let me make this bigger. Oh, geez. Okay. So this is the code for that button. This is a Razor view. If you don't know about .NET, don't worry about it. It's just some HTML and it's a templated language. And you can see that I have this target. Now, watch what I can do. I can make it, I can change the trigger, and I can actually tell it, hey, I want you to automatically run, not just on click, but also on load, right? So if I refresh the page, oh, I missed the target, the wrong one. It's my bad. Thank you, Joe. There we go. So as soon as I do it now, I don't have to click it. And it'll right away, as soon as it loads, because of that trigger, it makes that request and injects the HTML in there. If I click it, that also works. I can have multiple triggers. Where it gets really interesting is kind of the types of things you can do with this, and I'll show you a little bit more of this as I go through it. But I can also make it, if I refresh, every second, it'll make a request to the server just by setting the trigger to do it every single second, right? If you think about what you might have to write in JavaScript to accomplish this, right? So you would need some kind of set interval. You would have to manage the set interval. You would then have to make the request to the server, hopefully async and all that good stuff, and then inject it into the DOM, right? Which is not a ton, but this is definitely a lot simpler, right? And you can see I can just look at the output, and again, there's a date. There's plenty of other triggers. While I'm on this page, I'll just show you this one really quick. I'm going to change this back so it doesn't like clutter the network tab. And I'm going to scroll down. Now, what I have at the bottom of the page is an element, and it uses, it's actually right here. I should show it to you. It uses this trigger. So they can get a little bit more interesting, just a little bit. Intersect once, delay 2,000 milliseconds. So what this will do is basically implement lazy loading. As soon as it's in the viewport, it will make that request to /date, wait 2 seconds before it does it, and then it'll inject it into the DOM. So I'll do that now. And there it goes, lazy loaded after 2 seconds, and boop, there it goes, right? So it didn't make the request unless it's visible, and then it does it. Again, if you think about what you might have had to do that, right? So intersection of server, some callbacks, then you need to do the set timeout and managing all of that and making sure you don't have any leaks. This is all you have to do here. It is, absolutely. Absolutely. It just makes it so that you don't have to worry about it. I agree. This isn't, again, this is not, there is JavaScript here, and you don't have to write it. You don't have to write it. Yes, that's exactly it. And so yeah, we'll talk more about the trade-offs, but yes, absolutely, there is still JavaScript. So let's now talk about, let me go back up and let me make this a little bit bigger. There we go, so you can actually see everything. So let's talk about this page. So for this page, all I'm doing is I'm just rendering a list of products. This is all just hard-coded stuff on the server, right? So it's just a catalog that I'm generating, and it's going to spit out the products. When I look at the contents of the page, I go here and I go to my response. And I know it's a little bit small. I should have checked how to, maybe I can like right click it, if only. I really thought there was an easy way to hide this thing, whatever. And what you'll see is just, HTML being rendered by the server. So here's my form for the search. Here's the cart, or here's the sample. Yeah, this is the product card. So you can see the card body. I've got my hx get here to get the details for that product. Now, one of the kind of interesting things about Htmx is depending on how you do it, if you care about progressive enhancement, not everybody does. I don't care a ton about it. Some people really care about it. You wouldn't necessarily do an hx get on a link. You would actually give it an href, and you would just let it go to the other page. So if your JavaScript doesn't load for whatever reason, you just simply go to the next page, right? Which browsers are generally used to do. What's neat about this is that I can now make that request and just inject the contents in here, right? If I wanted to see the contents of that product directly in here without doing an entire multi-page navigation event. Now, before I show you that, one of the things I wanted to implement here was add to cart details page, because it gets complicated for other reasons. And so if I want to add to cart, what just happened there is two things. The first one is I did a post request to cart, which literally just returns text. I didn't even put it in a span because I'm, just a rebel. And you can see the post request going to the cart endpoint. If I scroll down a little bit, if I go to payload, not payload, preview, not response, I'll get it eventually. That's the HTML that goes in place, right? And I don't even really need to show you the code and in VS Code, because it's literally what all of these buttons have, right? So here is, and in this case, it's just a form. It posts to cart. It replaces the current target, so the current element is a target. You have a hidden field that has the product value. And I know this pattern is something that I'm sure many of us have been doing this for a while, have done a million times in the past. Send it to the server. You can ignore this. This is .NET security stuff. Not close it though. Oh, that actually got a little better. And that works as you would expect. But did somebody else notice what happened when I did that? I'm gonna do it again. Yeah. So at the top, we have this other element and it's updating. So when I add to cart, it needs to update the number of items in my cart. And so the way I've generally done this, I have some JS. If it's two separate components, whatever it is, I have an event that just says, hey, something was added to cart. Go ahead and increment it. Reload the summary of the cart, whatever, something like that. And so the way you do this in Htmx is actually pretty cool. So it's two steps. The first step is if I go up here, you mark the UL for the navigation with an hx user. An hx get to the user endpoint. So that gets the current summary for the user that's currently visiting the site. And then you have a trigger. And the trigger is update summary, which is an event, a custom event that I've created. And from body, I'm sure you can have events triggered to specific elements only, but I don't care in this case. If it happens anywhere on the page, I want to update it. And so what that means from what we saw earlier is that when that event triggers, it makes a request to the server and then injects it in the target, right? In this case, it's just going to swap the outer HTML. It's just basically going to do it in place. So how does that work? How does that event get triggered? And it turns out it's the server that's responsible. And I can show you. So if I do add to cart, let me actually open the network tab first. I can make this one a little smaller. Yeah, there we go. I'm going to add to cart. And what's really interesting is that here is hx trigger in the response from the server, update summary, which matches the trigger that you saw up top. And that's kind of all you have to do here. You make that request to the server says, yep, you're good, here's your HTML, but also trigger this event. What's really cool about this too, and while I'm here, I'll show you, is Htmx is going to send additional headers to the server that will help you make decisions at the server level. And I'll show you why that's important, but the server is heavily responsible for what ends up happening in your UI. It takes that away from your client, right? Which again is kind of weird. We're not really used to doing that, right? So I can then show you the next thing, which is let's visit the cart. And so I added a little bit of a delay there on purpose, because one of the things we deal with is we want to be able to cache the page that contains the cart, just so we don't have to deal with um, processing it on the server. And then it loads the cart for the user. That's very similar to what happened with the onload trigger, right? The page loads, we load the cart, no problem. And if I go here, there is this current, so cart current endpoint. And if I look at the response from the server, it has a cart wrapper, the row, the images, and every single product is just included there, right? And if I refresh the page, obviously it's going to continue working because it's just a different endpoint and it's going to request it. Now I could actually go to this URL and you would just see a broken set of HTML. However, in some cases, what's really useful is you can actually check on the server if the request is an HTMX request. And if it is, you may send a partial set of HTML. But if it isn't, you might send the whole thing, right? So you might say, well, I'm on like /cart. If this was, maybe this worked a little bit differently. Actually, I do this for the register form. What a good segue. Look at that. It's almost like I planned it. If I load the register form and then I submit, what ends up happening, the server is only going to send me a chunk back, right? And so how do I determine if I need to do that, just send the chunk back or send the whole thing back? If you're doing progressive enhancement, you would want to consider like, okay, I've got my form. If JS doesn't work, I need to be able to post to that endpoint and then display the entire template and then the actual form again with whatever output. And this will work just fine. And I can actually, I could turn it off, but essentially it's just going to make a request to the server and that's it. If I show you what's actually happening on the server, here's register. Here is what the server is sending back, but you can see it starts at the form, right? And it is the same view that I'm using to actually render this page, right? And this actually contains everything if I do a full reload. Now, for form validation, simply posting to the server. On the server, you just add to your HTML field is required, whatever you need. I lifted this straight from their demo, which is a sample for like, just kind of showing slightly different validation options. And then I posted, I've now logged in. I did a very simple, it's all fake, of course. And it works, and again, it's very seamless, right? One of the other cool things about this, and note that there is no server navigation. So I'm going to hit preserve log is off, right? So what that means is if I make multiple requests to the server, multiple document requests without preserve log, they will all just get cleared out in the in DevTools, right? So if I left it on, you would still see them, but I'm leaving it off so you can see that they're totally different, that it's still within the same context, right? So I'm going to go ahead and go to the cart. And that is a totally different page with a client-side navigation transition, and it works just as you would expect, right? Now, how does that work? Because if I show you this and I inspect, that's just a link. There's nothing special about it. So what did Htmx do to make that work? And what they have is something called HX Boost. And I've just put it on the body tag because I was like, let's see what happens if I make everything client-side navigation, even though it kind of drives me the wrong way sometimes, but I wanted to try it. And what will happen is you put it at whatever element, and then every child element will inherit it. And what it does is it basically figures out that you're doing a get to whatever the href is, and automatically replaces all the contents for you. And that's it. It just works, right? And I say it just works with a little asterisk because obviously, depending on how you set things up, you might have some issues. And what I mean by that is, the mixture of like HX gets, HX boost, and knowing when to render partials versus the entire block of HTML can be a little bit weird. So it's just something to be aware of. And as you test it, it becomes very apparent. When Nisha was running into it, the cart, I think I was doing a delete or something, and I wanted to send the cart back from the server. And instead of just sending the partial, I would send all of the HTML. And so what would happen is I would remove one element and the entire card would be replaced with the title and the navigation and the search and everything again. So the errors are pretty obvious, right? And I can actually show you that. So let's do a network tab. And if I hit remove, I'll make this a little bit bigger. I'm making a delete request to the server. It could be a post, it could be whatever makes you happy. We don't have to argue about verbs, but I like delete. So I'm then sending the card back from the server. And what I'm doing to do this is on the server, I am checking to see what type of request it is. So let's go ahead and show you kind of how that works. So this is this is product, and you can see that I've done it in other places too, but let me see, index, yeah. So this is the cart index page or view. And yes, I know it's a little bit of C#, but you'll be okay, I promise. You can see that we can detect if it's an HTMX request by checking a header. We can also check if you have HTMX boost on. And you can get both of these details in the request. So depending on what that is, you may want to disable the layout. And .NET, what this means is if you set the layout to null, you're only going to send the markup that is down here. That's all you're doing, right? So when I didn't have this, I go back here, I refresh, and I remove it. Oh, it works fine, because of course it does. Hold on, let me delete it. I've had some issues with that. Oh, it's making me look like a liar. Hold on. Oh, I know what it is. Yeah, damn it. I've been out this whole time. We made it without a jab, but you're so right. All right, hold on. Here we go, card controller. I think I know what I did wrong. Card delete. Hold on. Yeah, here we go. This is the original version of this code, and I am going to have to restart the app, only the app. I'm going to make this false just for fun. I was checking it in the view at some point, and anyway, hopefully this will work. Because if not, that'll be really embarrassing. All right, let's see. And I'm going to add something else to the cart first. Come on, do me a solid. Oh, come on. Write shitty code. I can. It's possible. It happens all the time. They review it constantly. Hold on a second. Hold on a second. Oh, I know what I did. 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 This guy. Yeah. Wrong file. Wrong file. Classic. There you go. You can see it there. Yeah. So if you're not careful, then that kind of shit will start to happen. And let me do this. And if you don't test your presentations before you give them, you'll be a little embarrassed. It happens. It's okay. And you can see that it just kind of keeps doing that, right? So these issues become very obvious. And again, it's just about you kind of testing the things you're doing before you leave them, and don't do what I'm doing and test in production while you're giving a talk. But it definitely is kind of the I think it's funny. I think it's kind of like goofy how it'll behave that way. But anyway, this is one of the obvious things that you kind of have to deal with. What else do I have? We can talk about the search feature. So search is really interesting because this is a very contrived example of search. Most or a lot of searches you're going to see will have some kind of like autocomplete setup, right? It's going to do all kinds of fancy stuff and personalization and all kinds of insane stuff. This search is not that. But I just wanted to kind of get an idea of what other triggers I could use, right? And so I'm going to go ahead and search for product. And I search for product one, and there it goes. The server was starting up, so it's a little slower there, right? Which is interesting to note. And you can see that it just does my results, and it goes through. Now, if I keep typing, it's not going to do anything. Once I stop typing, it'll debounce and make the request, which is pretty cool. And I can also just type and then hit enter and do it. And the way this works, I actually really like. I think for like a simple type of search, it's pretty handy. Where is it? Here we go. Here's the trigger, right? So on key up or when the input changes, we delay it by 500 milliseconds. So it's doing debouncing for 500 milliseconds. And search is the trigger for when you just hit enter. You're like, just go. I wanna get my search done now. And that's pretty cool. And the last thing, this is where I thought like this started to feel a lot better. And this isn't exclusive to Htmx. There is a new feature coming in to a browser near you. I know Chrome has it now, CSS view transitions. And for anybody not familiar, it's essentially going to, and I'm going to butcher this, and maybe Joey might be able to like explain this a little bit better. But my understanding is you can basically do transition animations and sort of between, if you're navigating from one page to another or injecting content into the browser, you can then make it seamless. So you could like have something fade from another view that is being loaded from the server, right? As opposed to having this sort of jarring like multi-page setup, or even just in place injection of content as HTMX likes to do. So I'm going to click on one of these, and I'll watch what happens. And it's very subtle. I'm going to go ahead and go back in the browser because not the navigation works, which is really nice. And it's a really nice sort of transition into what you're actually trying to show them. I then also wanted to be able to do a little simple selection. I kept the transitions so that it looked cool. Obviously, I'm not a designer, but you can see you can actually change these. It does a little transition instead of, again, that jarring thing. And I want to say all you have to do, first of all, is steal somebody's CSS animation, put it in a class and pretend like you did it, which I definitely didn't. I took this from HTMX's docs. And then there is, let me just see, I believe it is on this. Yeah. You have to set the swap to inner HTML and transition true. And HTMX will hook you up with the rest. Essentially, it just calls the, like Joe said, JavaScript APIs to kind of make this work. Correct. Correct. Yes. Yes. Oh, yes. Thank you. Yes. So this was in the link. Then if I go to this one and then I make a selection, it does the same transition. So yes, it is in the link on this one. I also put it on the add to cart for fun. So you can see it just sort of like gets it out of the way and you get a little. And obviously somebody with more talent than me at CSS could make this look amazing. It's a really exciting feature, honestly, for the web because it's just amazing. It's something that we should have had ages ago, and it's just really nice to see. Um, oh, I don't know. Well, at least 3 versions of jQuery. If you don't have at least 3 versions, then you're not doing it right. It happened. Oh my God. Oh, you just threw me. Oh, the time machine, jQuery mobile. Jesus. Anyway, um, so one of the cool things here too, when I when I make this request, notice that the URL is changing, right? So if you in order to accomplish that, or the reason I accomplish this is so that if I refresh or I go to this page, then I still get the content, right? That's not an HTMX request, so it'll render the full thing. When I'm making this switch here, it'll be a partial request. This is where those header checks, when you do them properly, not when you mess up like I did earlier, will come in really handy. So if I show you really quick here, green, here's green, and I'm just sending the product details, right? Just that small partial. Otherwise, I would send the whole thing down, right? If I'm doing a full refresh on the page. Great question. The URL updates. I'll let you take a guess. Well, yes. So the actual URL ends up getting updated by JavaScript. But what do you think triggers that JavaScript? It's a header in the server. Yeah. So when I change this and I look at this request, and I'll show you the headers. Here's the response headers, hx push URL, and I just tell it what URL I want, and it just puts it into history, right? Which turns this whole thing into just a very seamless experience. So what's cool is, again, like I'm pushing URL so I can use forwards and back in the browser. And I hate to say it just works because I'm sure there's all kinds of nonsense you can run into, but it works very seamlessly. And it did not take me that long to come up with this. Honestly, it took me longer to like relearn a little bit of Bootstrap enough to be able to together than to actually get this functional, if I'm honest. Mhm. Sure. So, I mean, you could always do the native, like just natively, like, because you can write your own JS if you want to. Like, you can, again, enhance it. So, one of the examples we have in some of our sites is we'll have like a little popover up top. There's no popover in the browser yet. It's so close. But if you need that, you're going to be using something. Well, even if you're using jQuery, you're using some JavaScript for it, and this is no different. So you would probably write something like that if you needed to. Now, there's also If we were to go to the docs, believe it or not, I've looked at these. I know it doesn't look like it, but in some of these, somewhere is here we go. There's I've been here before, I swear. Here we go. JavaScript API. So it depends. Yeah. So maybe you have a request that you know is slow and you want to get ahead of it. There might be weird situations. And I'll tell you about some of the issues and some of the things that I haven't figured out yet, right? Now I believe you can do, let me see, fine. I think all it's doing is just a native like URL push in the browser. Like it's just adding it to the history. I don't think it's doing anything special. Yeah, I could be wrong about that. But yeah, I believe that's all that's happening. So you could do that yourself. And you might be able to do this maybe with Hyperscript or something else, which is kind of the companion for this if you're, if you need a little bit more. So that's kind of the whole demo that I have. Now, I'll tell you some of the issues that I run into or things that I haven't figured out yet, right? So you can add indicators for all of these. So if you needed to do a spinner, if you know you're going to have a slow page or a search, and kind of like you saw in the cart, I have that loading cart text, right? So you can make it, and they have pretty nice ways of adding transitions. So if you want to do animations of like a slow fade out and then it disappears and you delete something, you can do all kinds of great stuff. Their examples actually cover a lot of these sort of weird scenarios that people run into with some code samples, and it was actually really helpful. And the other thing is that I don't know how you handle errors. So I know, I know, I know. So errors is interesting because so if my server is alive, the server can return a 500 or maybe just some, piece of HTML that defines the error and I can show it somewhere. Or you could potentially change the target and show it in a little pop-up or whatever it is, right? But what if my server's dead? What if if I'm doing a deployment or something and I messed up the database and, I'm like furiously trying to fix it and somebody tries to go to the site. Um, I don't know what happens in that case. I haven't gotten that far. I would imagine there's some hook or some event that you can go into and then add either a little bit of JavaScript or something to make that. Hmm. Hmm. Sure. So I'll give you an example. We'll go back to the form, right? So if I go to the form and I submit it, so this is wrong because it's returning a 200. I should have changed that. This really should be a 400. Now, I actually don't know if HTMX cares what the response is. I actually realize that now because I thought I was returning a 400. But then it usually will do that if you have a validation error. It says bad request. And so I wonder, yeah, yeah, it's just HTML. Oh, yeah, sorry. Thank you. So it's just HTML and it happens to have the validation fields in here, right? So here we go. Yes, which technically yes. So that's yeah, and so this is where I'm not sure how you would handle this. Is it technically a 200 because it was succeeded? It succeeded to give you the error message, or right? Yes, you have to send the whole thing down. So great question. And so I don't know how you would deal with that specifically. I know for what was it? I think it was like paginated content or maybe like almost like an infinite scroll situation. And I know HTMX has something around this. Turbo has it too, where you can stream only the chunks you care about. And so that kind of is up to you to figure out. Like I don't know enough about how that works, but you can make it more efficient. And I am vague on that, I'll be honest, but I know there's ways to make it better. So right, and there's also this idea of like out of band swaps that might come into play, where you can from the server say, hey, this piece goes here, this piece goes there. So you might be able to say this piece goes to that. Kinda, yeah, right, yes. So perhaps interesting, interesting. a great question. I don't know. I would think.
Because it looked like the client has to
Yeah.
decide.
So yes, so I believe the way you would do it, and I think this is kind of it depends on how you deal with it. So it's really cool. Kind of, I've gone through, I've like scratched the surface, right? So you might be able to say, hey, actually, the target is now this other thing, and so you might be able to say, don't show it here, show an error message somewhere else, whatever it is. It depends on your case. Again, I yeah, there's definitely some things that I'm not super. Yes. Well, no, the server absolutely knows. This is a response header. So on your server, you say retarget this. So you're saying I want to put it on ID 123. I'm telling you, no, no, no. The server's gonna put it somewhere else, which is yeah, it is a yeah. I know. I think so I will tell you this. What kind of where I started to kind of get it, where it clicked a little bit more. If I look at the HTML that I sent back from the server, let me see if I look at cart. Let me see if I can find this. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So you see up here, so I've got the trigger for the thing at the top, and this triggers from the event or on load. So on load, I want to make sure that it loads, right? And what happened was I was sending this partial back from the server when I load the user specific one. And what happened was that it would load and then it would trigger and then it would load and then it would trigger and then it would load, until you end up doing an infinite loop. And I'm like, how the hell do I stop it? And then I realized, oh, it's actually pretty simple. You have to tell the server has to tell you like, don't do it on load now, right? So when I look at user, you'll see that it just has update summary from body. It doesn't have load. So the server is telling you what this behavior is, right? It's like telling you here's the link or here's the form. That form is no longer available. It kind of is is making that decision for you, which is interesting. It's interesting. I'm still kind of on the fence about some of this, but um, I think that's still pretty cool. Yes. Yeah, so it's because it had a load. So it just yeah, it just kept it was pretty funny. Because I had DevTools closed for a bit and I had no idea. And then eventually I go back and I just started seeing it's just going like crazy. Yeah, I mean it was reloading like so many different times. It was nuts. But so let's go. I mean that's pretty much it for the demo. Yeah. Yeah. I don't think it's too much. Yes, there is a JavaScript API, if that's what you mean. So you can do certain things through it. So I was, let me see, I think it's towards the bottom here. Yeah, so there's you can do, oh no. Yeah, there we go. So you can do, I haven't touched these, to be totally clear. You can do a lot of this stuff, and you can again do things through the JavaScript API if you need it. So you might have a popover, a tooltip, whatever, or maybe a modal. The way they deal with modals is pretty ugly. I wanted to do, hey, you've added it to your cart. Here's a little modal. Go here, whatever. And I'll tell you, I wasn't happy with what they were suggesting. Um, and before I go back to the PowerPoint, the one thing that I think is funny, so I definitely recommend you take a look at these. And these are all examples that they've put together that kind of show a lot of these concepts. Your bulk upload or updates, all this infinite scroll, which is pretty interesting, right? Like, how would you do this? And this whole time, I was thinking, like, why do they have this thing at the bottom that shows me the requests that are being made? Because I can just open DevTools, right? I don't know. I thought that was reasonable because this whole thing is about the server. And what I thought was funny is that let's let it make some more requests. Weird, no requests. It's client side. It's JavaScript that makes it look like it's making the server request. And so with that, we're going to talk about some trade-offs of this. I just thought it was hilarious. I'm like, this is, yeah, sure. No idea.
Some requirement to do it that way? Why would they have,
Right. Why wouldn't it just be in the markup or something? Like, I don't know.
if they're gonna be, if their JavaScript API is to interact with their stuff, why is their JavaScript API look like jQuery?
Great question.
Okay.
I've wondered the same thing. I'm like, I don't know why this is needed. I would, hopefully there's a good reason, but I don't know what it is, to be honest with you. I haven't gotten that far. But it is, yeah, please do the, oh, just go back. Mhm. Correct. The server does all the rendering. So you know, what React does, right? It takes some JSON and then, or some state, and then turns it into a bunch of DOM elements. That's all not going to be the server. The server is all that's doing it. So you don't have to render JSON anymore. You don't have to, you're just literally generating HTML from the server every time. And the client, all it has to do is take that response and just inject it right into the DOM, which is interesting, right? Yes, yes, you would add the goodness to it. Yes, capital G goodness. But yeah, you wouldn't have any of that on the client anymore. I mean, if just HTMX is good enough, right? Because depending on your app, it may not be. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the trade-offs because there's definitely some trade-offs as you've seen. We kind of already discussed a couple, but any other code questions? Hmm. Yes, correct. And the next request, instead of saying page 2, we'll say page 3, and then page 4, and then so they're probably exactly, yes, absolutely they're cheating. So if I go to examples, even just a simple one, like click to edit, right? And I go here and I click to edit. Oh, actually, no, this is something else. This is my one password. So there's no request. They literally wrote vanilla JavaScript to make it look like it's working. Exactly, exactly. And so I think it's hilarious because that's the biggest thing. And I was like, God, come on, like they're showing it like that. I'm guessing because they didn't want to pay the server fees and deal with all of that stuff, which yes, and it says a lot about HTMX. Like I still think it's really cool. Like for certain things, I think it's really powerful. Would I build an entire app with it? I mean, maybe if it's really simple. If I'm building a blog or something, like yeah, it'll be fine. The guy just released a book and it's like it was #1 in computer science, something on Amazon. So I think maybe we'll get an actual server here soon. I hope we do. Um, um, I'm sorry. They might be, yeah. They got a lot of funding now. I mean, they're doing better. I don't know if a lot of funding, but they have funding to some degree. Yes, they are. Let me see. It was here. It was like first funding. I remember seeing it. I saw the banner somewhere. Maybe it was on their homepage. Oh, here we go. GitHub. We're accepted into the first class of GitHub Open Source Accelerator. I'm assuming they get some funding through that. I would recommend if you have some time, take a look at these like essays. I think it's hilarious that they're called essays. Um, but there's some really interesting concepts and sort of how they like why they're approaching things in this way and the benefits and trade-offs and things like that. And they're very clear about the trade-offs. Like they have a whole thing about I think it's like should you use it? I think I have it in the let's go back to the PowerPoint and I think I've got it in here. We've kind of talked about some of these already, but so when it might, oh, here we go. When it might not be for you, and let me just stop this for a second. Yeah, when should you use Hypermedia, right? And they will be very upfront about when you might not. So if you or when you might. So when if your UI is mostly text and images, which is a lot of websites, not all websites, it might be a good example. They have this link to the mother of all Htmx demos is this app that was built by I think it's a French developer, and it's a pretty involved application. All HTMX driven. They have a whole case study on how much code they were able to reduce, right? It's really interesting. I think it's worth a watch because I have a whole YouTube video about it. If you're doing CRUD type stuff, it's good. If you have a lot of nesting, it works well. But then, more importantly, it does, and they do talk about how it will, to some degree, affect how your UI is built, right? Because the way you structure your UI is so critical to how the UI functions, right? So that's something to keep in mind. And then yeah, deep links and good first render performance, again, SEO, your time to first bytes, all the kind of things you get from server-side rendering. Where you might not want it is if you have a lot of dynamic interdependencies, and they talk about this, and I'm gonna get this text out of here because it's a little distracting. I'm just gonna go back here. But where you may not want to deal with that is if you have, for example, like something like a spreadsheet app, I think is what they use as a sample, because every time you change one, technically it could update every single other. So how would you do that? How would your server know? You wouldn't want to keep all that state on the server, so it just doesn't make sense. They also tell you like if you want to build a game on the browser, don't use this. I mean, it kind of goes without saying. I mean, I did do Tetris and without Canvas, which was, I'm sure hilariously slow behind the scenes, but you wouldn't use HTMX for that. You don't want to go to the server for that. And again, if you don't want to have a server, like Joe said, you're gonna put your docs on GitHub pages. Guess what? You don't get a server, right? If you're just doing a flat publish to S3 or whatever you're using, no server. Or if your server is slow, right? If you have like a really slow server or your users are far away from your server, that's a problem, right? Because now you have to wait for that, and that can be an issue. Now, on the bright side, you can always, obviously, if you can afford to, you can put your application behind the CDN, use Cloudflare or something, and all your gets, you just let them be cached. And in those cases, it would be at the edge wherever your users are, or at least closer to them, and it would perform better. Doesn't solve your posts, obviously. But it might be interesting if you're using something like, I don't know, maybe Edge Workers or some way to like, and I was thinking about this. I'm like, wouldn't it be funny? Like one of the biggest issues I had with all of this was the templating languages on the back end mostly just suck. Um, and I ended up going back to .NET because I use it all the time, and I actually think Razor is competitive compared to things like, well, I don't want to call anybody out, but I tried EJS, I hated it. I've tried Handlebars before, I'm not a fan. I've tried a bunch of these. It just wasn't working for me. Um, but I'm very familiar with the .NET ecosystem, and it worked great. Um, but anyway, depending on your setup, you just have to be mindful of how your application is hosted. And again, like we've talked about this, like this is, kind of bringing it back because obviously, talking about these things and seeing the hype on Twitter, which by the way, I recommend you follow the HTMX guy because he's just trolling everybody, and it's great. It's good fun. Because it's people complaining about like, oh my God, what do you mean my server will send me HTML? And he's like, yeah, I imagine the travesty, like, but funny, but like really funny, right? And it's just really interesting, and because we're so used to doing things a certain way. Um, there's one other thing that I actually thought was a really good point, and actually, Lucas, you brought this up when we were talking about this, which I thought was a brilliant point. One of the things that makes HTMX difficult to use is as a developer parsing the state that's in HTML compared to parsing JSON. So imagine you have 10 different fields with different values. Now you're digging through HTML to see where they're at, as opposed to just looking at some JSON. And I was like, that's such a good observation, because yeah, and especially if you have a big old form, and it's not like developers will abuse diffs and put them all over the place and nest them a bunch of times, right? So, um, but it has some companions. So Hyperscript is one of the big ones. It basically allows you to add a little bit of more client side kind of interaction at the cost of having to use this sort of weird DSL that they've created. I won't go too much into it because I haven't really used it that much, but I would recommend you take a look at it. So allows you to screw with the state a little bit and maybe trigger certain interactions with like a very English-like language. Not a fan. Yes,
Like, is it from the same creators?
I believe so. It's treated as like the companion to HTMX. But you can see. Mhm. Yeah,
It's like the companion of HTMX.
yeah,
So was this also like, okay, here's some shit you actually need?
right.
If you want to do anything.
If you want to do right, so you can do fun things like this. Like, I'm not a fan. I'm not a fan. I'm not a fan. Exactly. I am not sure, but like, look at you can do stuff like this. I don't know what this means. So I kind of you can kind of init fetch as JSON, then put results into me, right? So there is some interesting stuff on here. I haven't used it. I think it's like I don't know what this means. But if you're I don't want to put elements inside quotes. I don't I this makes me feel weird. I don't like it. But I haven't used it, so I might give it a shot. And so this is interesting, right? So on pointer down, repeat until event pointer up, and then you're setting some variables, and then you can see that it press and hold, right? And it's doing the thing. Your mileage may vary. That's all I gotta say. There's also Alpine JS, which I believe is also commonly used with this, and it does sort of similar things like setting your states and things like that. So for an example, I think they have an example for a counter, the kind of, yeah, here you go. So, stuff like this is a little weird. Um,
It's a good question. How long HTMX has been? It's been around for a while, and it's very
mhm,
one, with all the attributes.
right.
Prompted you to make the team. I think Alpine came out, and it was based heavily on Vue. Oh, Alpine is based on Vue. Yeah, it's came after Vue.
Mhm.
Vue.
Oh, interesting.
Is a simpler. But I mean, all of this is very like Angular 1. I mean,
It is. This is much better than, in my opinion. It's very subjective, but I think we all kind of had a visceral reaction. Yeah, I think we all kind of had a reaction to that. So this is not bad. Um, um, Again, I don't know. Some people really like it. To each their own. But I will say this, right? Again, and just going back to my just kind of the ending here. You don't have to abandon everything that we've been doing, right? You can always kind of integrate things together. So, I can see a situation where you might use HTMX for some things, and you might, maybe use React or Preact or even like I don't know, jQuery to do a little bit of interactivity that you might be missing with just HTMX, right? So it's worth. I think HTMX is really cool. I think it's going around. I think it also simplifies things like crazy. No build step. I just compile it and I go. So for certain apps, I think it's worth considering. Would I use it for everything? Obviously not. For some of the stuff we're doing, it'll definitely be, I think, an improvement over some of the things we've had to do. We've committed crimes against humanity when it comes to React and a lack of server-side rendering. Ryan knows. I think Levente and Lucas have put up with me talking about this too. But we kind of do what we can. We got to make Google happy at the end of the day, and so we've had to do some things that we're not necessarily proud of. And I think this will clean a lot of that up. So if you're in a situation where you need that server-side aspect of it and you don't have a Node backend, hey, maybe, and also make it fast, obviously, because Node is slow. It seems like a viable option. I want to do one of the things I mentioned is the incremental adoption. So I want to put it into our system and replace a couple areas. And the demo kind of shows you the areas that I'm worried about. And in fact, what's interesting is when we were working on one of the features for our e-commerce platform, if you think about a set of search results, a lot of times you'll have like a little quick view option. and it just get a little pop-up, and then you see a summary of the product and some images and stuff. And in our case, it was the same markup that the details page had. And so how did we solve that? And before knowing about HTMX, we said, well, let's just get the HTML from the server. That's okay. And we've done this in the past. Like what, 7, 8 years ago with our previous systems, we did the same thing. We wanted to share it, but it was client-side driven, so we couldn't send the template down, and we didn't want to just always have it because it wasn't always needed, and there was so much stuff that needed to be rendered, and we didn't want to have like a client-side version and a server-side version. So we are like, let's just send the HTML down and then enhance it client-side. And so we had been doing kind of the same thing in some cases where it just sort of made sense as a solution. It's not always the case, but that's the kind of problem that we're trying to solve. And I think this does it more elegantly in some ways. But yeah, it kind of validates that design decision, I think. I don't know. I don't know if HTMX is invasive enough that it'll see the DOM being updated and automatically, like, you know what I mean? Because if a re-render happens and if it happens to change, like adds a new element, I don't know if it will catch that. I have no idea. Hmm. So, right, render to stream or so I usually don't tweet, and I went out earlier and I said, the seeing how crappy a lot of these like backend frameworks are, it hit me, and I'm like, it would be really nice for structuring all of your HTML into like reusable components. It really would be React. And it's almost like if you take something like Remix that just does server-side rendering, you get rid of all of the JavaScript that it normally renders. There's a scripts component. If you're familiar with Remix, it kind of tries to be like a sort of a PHP on the servers type thing, but it's React based. And so you could almost use React's component model to manage all of this, but then just not do any React on the client side. So in theory, you could do that, which I thought was really funny because it's just kind of shifting things around a lot. But it might not be totally terrible, honestly, if you needed something. Because again, the templating languages suck. If you could do JSX and then still get the benefit, maybe. Yeah, which that's right. That's right. Which is it hurts. It hurts. It hurts. It hurts. But because we've been fighting it. We've had sites where like it just doesn't perform in the server, and you're just like, God, this just sucks. That you get whatever however few requests a second. It doesn't matter. Like it's just slow and all these other issues, but maybe and you cache it enough, maybe it would be fine because that component model is really good. ASP.NET has different options, right? So you can do partial views, you can do tag helpers, you can do view components, and they all sort of get close, but it never feels right. I miss just props and dynamically messing with my components, and sometimes, I don't know if you can do some sort of like render props. Like I miss some of that, and it would be cool to have something that was in the middle of both, that performs better. So I don't know, maybe something will come up at some point. I'll be honest, I mean, I don't know enough about other frameworks. I haven't played with Flask. I don't know how it deals with that. I haven't played with, like, I don't know, there's all the other ones. But I'm sure there's something out there that might be better, but honestly, .NET was such a good fit for everything that we were doing. Oh, and I did do this. This is the last final thing. I deployed this to Azure just for fun, because I wanted to see how it would perform. And I sent this to USC, so I didn't go that far, so I'm kind of cheating. But generally speaking, like, each request, instead of taking like 4 milliseconds, might take 50 or 60. It's still, for the most part, you won't be able to tell. But as always, if you're doing async stuff, please put spinners on your UI so that I know that something is happening, because it drives me nuts. I saw one app that some guy built, and you would click around, you would click, and nothing would happen. Nothing would happen. And then boom, here comes the UI. And this is what Next does by default. What's that? Y- Yes. It drives me insane. And this is like one of the top things I complain about in code reviews. Like, please put a spinner on here. You're gonna make users wait. You can make it show up, I'm sure, a little bit, yes, but at least put it on there if it's gonna be perceivable. And this person hadn't, and it was HTMX driven. and it felt terrible, right? And obviously this is super contrived. It's a tiny little app, but for the most part, it performs very well. There's barely any backend, so it's all pretend. So obviously, if I'm actually hitting a database, if I'm doing all these different things, you want something like what I did here, which just tells you, hey, we're loading your cart. Give me a second. Just kind of keep that in mind. But yeah, that's all I've got. Thanks, guys. Oh, no, I didn't. I can show it really quick. Yeah, no worries. I'll be honest, there is not much to it. On the server, I do send this from the server. So here's my loading cart. I added my indicator class. I couldn't quite get it to work, and I'm very sleep deprived, so I just say whatever, it shows up. It doesn't have to be pretty. And then I have this guy here, which makes a request, triggers on load, and this is the loading cart. Oh, sorry, this is pointing it to be, yeah, actually, I guess it does work. It's just pointing the indicator and saying, hey, this one is indicating the load of it. As soon as the cart appears, it just, eats it up. Did I get this right? Yeah, hold on, because I might have. I think this might actually not be doing anything here. Yeah, because I think yes. Yes, it is a fake delay on the server, but I think I'm looking at this now. I think this might not actually be working because it's swapping out the cart. So the actual cart does come. This is this current cart row, cart wrapper. Hold on a second. Let's figure this out. Cart wrapper. Oh, it is just hidden. It is just hidden. It is just hidden because of the indicator class. So it stays in there, and then the class will, basically HTMX will add classes. Yeah, here, let me. Mhm. Initially, on the first request, yes. 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 It sent it, yes. Right. It does HTMX basically adds some stuff in there to make those trigger. But yes, the original load. So this is what you first get from the server. Is gonna do, where are we at? Let's do cart. Not this one. It's this one. This is the first load. So you've got the loader. Yeah, the server just right. Well, the somehow is this trigger on load. It starts. Yeah. And then it gets injected, but as inner HTML of this one, it just so happens to be that because I have that class on the indicator, HTMX will change it. And it's like HTMX.indicator or something, and then magic happens. I mean, the classes are there, and it's No, you're fine. You're fine. Uh-huh. Yeah. Right. The server sends this. Yeah. So this is what card current is. Yeah. It's all of this stuff. I promise it does. But it is cool. I think it's nice to try something different. I'll say that much. We've seen so many damn apps these days that just perform like crap. And I'm always gonna go to, like, if you use Reddit at all, the main site is just awful. It's just to me it's unusable. This is why everybody wants to go to old.reddit.com or whatever, because it's the old school one, or use a phone app because the site sucks. They're rewriting it. I don't know if you guys know this, but they have, if you go to sh.reddit.com, they have a version written in lit. Um, Built kind of slow. And I think some of that has to do with their backend being slow too. But yeah, I know, for very cheap. It's very affordable. Yeah, I heard. I haven't been to Reddit ever since Apollo died. I'm like, you know what? I guess I'm done. Anyway, thanks, guys.